The final 24 hours of Henry VIII screaming in his own rot, surrounded by fear. January 27th, 1547. The air in Greenwich Palace was thick with the stench of sickness and decay, a grim perfume clinging to tapestries and courtiers alike. For years, the mighty King Henry VIII, once a symbol of vigor and youthful kingship, had been reduced to a grotesque parody of his former self, a colossus crumbling from within. His monstrous girth, inflamed ulcers festering on his legs, and the constant agonizing pain had transformed him into a tyrannical recluse, his screams of torment echoing through the royal chambers. Yet, on this particular day, the silence was more chilling, a foreboding quiet that settled upon the fearful household, for the end of a long, brutal reign was finally, irrevocably, at hand. This was no ordinary deathbed vigil. It was a reckoning, a final public suffering that held the court captive, watching the unraveling of a monarch who had defined an era through sheer will and terrifying caprice. The weight of his brutal legacy hung heavy, a palpable presence in the very room where he lay, gasping for breath. To understand why this man, once celebrated as the Golden Prince, found his final hours consumed by such abject suffering, we must journey back through the years of his relentless pursuit of power and progeny. His reign, spanning nearly 4 decades, had been a cataclysm of religious upheaval, political machinations, and the ruthless elimination of any perceived obstacle. The dissolution of the monasteries had not only filled his coffers, but had also shattered centuries of spiritual tradition, unleashing a wave of fear and uncertainty across the land. Those who dared question his supreme authority, from revered statesmen like Sir Thomas More to faithful servants and even queens, found themselves caught in the merciless grind of his sovereign will. Each execution, each swift, decisive act of cruelty, had cemented his image as an unchallengeable force. But it had also sown seeds of quiet dissent and profound, lingering dread throughout the kingdom. The power he wielded was absolute, yet it was also a crushing burden, a heavy crown forged in the crucible of his own unchecked desires, and the blood of countless souls. But to grasp the weight of this moment, as Henry lay dying, we must consider the nature of the court that surrounded him. It was a place of suffocating intrigue, where loyalty was a fickle currency and ambition a dangerous game. For years, courtiers had navigated the king's volatile temper, his sudden rages, and his terrifying capacity for vengeance. Careers were made and broken, lives secured or utterly destroyed, on the whim of a man whose pain and paranoia grew daily. No one dared speak plainly of his impending death, for to even utter such a thought was to risk a charge of treason. Thus, a collective silence descended, a macabre ballet of whispered consultations and sidelong glances. The very air was thick with the unsaid, a testament to the suffocating fear that his immense authority had instilled, a fear so profound it persisted even as his life ebbed away, ensuring no one would risk his wrath even in his final moments. This was not an anomaly, it was a reflection of the very fabric of his rule. The fear that permeated his court had been cultivated over decades, a pervasive dread born from the public spectacle of dissenters' brutal ends. The executions of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas Cromwell, and countless others were not merely acts of justice, as he proclaimed, but meticulously orchestrated warnings. They were designed to ensure absolute compliance, to demonstrate that the king's will superseded all other laws, divine or human. The scaffold at Tower Hill became a chilling stage, where the fragility of human life and the terrifying scope of royal authority were starkly displayed. Each sacrifice, whether of an innocent queen or a principled minister, solidified his grip, yet it also irrevocably tainted his reign with a haunting stain of cruelty that time could never fully erase. The very foundations of his power were built upon the torn lives of those who had fallen victim to his tyrannical hand. Yet something went wrong in the architecture of this power. As his physical health declined, so too did his control, albeit subtly. The pain that racked his body had begun to dictate his temperament, making him more unpredictable, more prone to irrational outbursts. His once sharp intellect, dulled by suffering and age, was increasingly susceptible to manipulation by those closest to him, particularly the Protestant faction eager to consolidate power before his successor. The young Edward ascended the throne, The man who had once commanded legions now struggled to command his own failing body, and this internal struggle amplified the external anxieties of his court. The public image of an omnipotent monarch was dissolving, replaced by the grim reality of a dying man trapped within a decaying shell, his final acts less the thunder of divine authority and more the desperate flailing of a tormented soul. His cries were not of majesty, but of profound animal suffering. On the night of January 27th, his condition worsened dramatically. The chronic pain from his ulcerated leg, coupled with the fever and general decline, reached an unbearable crescendo. He screamed, his voice hoarse and raw, a sound far removed from the booming declarations of state he had once made. The chambers, once filled with the hushed reverence of courtiers, were now a chaotic tableau of frantic physicians and terrified attendants, none daring to offer comfort, none truly able to alleviate his agony. The stench of infected wounds, a constant companion, thickened in the air, a visceral reminder of his mortality, a stark contrast to the divine right he had always claimed. The mighty Lion of England was reduced to a whimpering, roaring husk, his once magnificent form now a source of profound disgust and pity, a horrifying manifestation of absolute power finally turning in on itself, devouring its own foundations. As dawn approached on January 28th, a quiet desperation filled the royal household. Sir Anthony Denny, the king's trusted attendant and chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, finally gathered the courage to approach the dying monarch. "Sir," he is said to have uttered, "the king's life is in peril. It is time for him to consider his end." The words, though carefully chosen, carried the weight of a death sentence, a truth no one else had dared to utter aloud. Henry, roused from a fitful, pain-ridden sleep, acknowledged his mortality, a stark and brutal admission from a man who had believed himself invincible. He requested Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the man who had facilitated his great divorce and the architect of his religious reforms, to be summoned. This final gesture, a call to the very personification of his ecclesiastical revolution, was not a plea for absolution, but a desperate attempt to reconcile with the divine power he had so often invoked, and perhaps so often defied. When Cranmer finally arrived, rushing from Croydon in the early morning light, he found the king unable to speak. The mighty voice that had commanded armies and reshaped a nation was reduced to a guttural murmur, a mere whisper in the echoing chamber. The archbishop, ever the loyal servant, asked Henry to give a sign that he trusted in God's mercy, and the king, with a final, monumental effort, squeezed Cranmer's hand. This last act of communication, a silent, desperate grip, was the final testament of a man who had lived his life in a roar of absolute authority, but who died in the quiet, agonizing solitude of his own physical decay. It was a profound, humbling moment, a stark reminder that even the most formidable of tyrants ultimately face the same vulnerability, the same terrifying silence of inevitable dissolution. The power he had wielded could not save him from the clutches of his own mortality. Henry VIII passed away shortly after. His death, carefully managed and initially kept secret for 3 days, to ensure a smooth transition of power to his young son, Edward VI, marked the end of an era. The relief that washed over the court, though unspoken, was palpable, a testament to the oppressive atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that had defined his final years. His reign, a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, innovation, and unparalleled cruelty, had irrevocably altered the course of English history, leaving behind a legacy of profound religious division and a monarchy forever transformed. The man who had defied popes and executed queens, who had remade England in his own image, had succumbed not to rebellion or political intrigue, but to the slow, relentless decay of his own body. A final, ironic defeat for a king who had so vehemently sought to control all aspects of his destiny. And so, we are left with the haunting echo of his end. The image of a king, once so vibrant and commanding, reduced to a screaming, decaying husk, surrounded by fear, serves as a sobering insight into the nature of absolute power. His life had never truly been his own, consumed by the demands of kingship and the endless pursuit of an heir, yet his choices were undeniably his. The brutal acts committed in his name, the innocent lives destroyed, the system meant to protect them having become their executioner, remain etched into the collective memory. It was not justice, it was often a warning, a stark example of unchecked authority. As we reflect upon his final hours, we are reminded that even the mightiest monarchs are ultimately mortal, their power fleeting, and their legacy forever stained by the torment they inflict. The true resolution is not in his peaceful passing, for there was little peace, but in the enduring, mournful understanding of the human cost of his reign.